situation, what we noticed in 2012, how much earlier the corn plants that had treatments of fertilizer shot tassels and started pollination. Now, some people may not think that's a big deal. However, the earlier we pollinate, trying to avoid as much of the heat, it's a good thing. The other thing, you start to, okay, what's going on within that plant? What caused that to happen? And that's some of the things we're going to talk about. When we look at nutrients, it's not always what's on the soil test, because what's on the soil test isn't always available to the crop. There are relationships between nutrients. And sometimes what we think may be a high reading, Ed's got soil test at the Plainsfield farm, he's got K 600-700 pounds the acre, and P 400.
Phosphorus is somewhere, was about 80, now we pulled it down to about 75.
Yeah, I'm thinking the 7, this is the 1 to 7 inch.
Yeah.
7 to 12 inch, K dropped to 400.
Yeah, it's kind of hurting down there.
But when we look at it, K is essential. There are actually 2 nutrients essential for nitrogen efficiency, and we all nitrogen is probably our #1 highest input for fertilizer. This is
256 trials. Yeah.
And with no P and K is in the red, with P and K is in the black. So if we look here, 262 bushel, and give or take 210 pounds of nitrogen. We would have to add 60 pounds of N to achieve the same yield if our K is not available at that corn plant. Now, I don't know too many guys that are willing to go out there and spend the money to put 270 pounds of nitrogen on. Plus, I don't know how many would like to talk about it, because I'm sure environmentally they wouldn't be welcomed by a lot of the groups that worry about water quality. So we have to consider what is optimum and how we can influence nutrient uptake, and especially K, help the plant avoid disease issues. So part of what we study here is how much K and where do we get at. We finally find the sweet spot where we really have a real strong relationship. Ed, help me out here. The ratios you find the most positive results on both K and sulfur is the other nutrient we're going to talk about.
Yeah, so potassium is really interesting in that ratio in the soil is sometimes a little bit ambiguous, because we don't always get all the K that's in there due to the amount of moisture in the soil. And this year down in Pleasant Plains, when we ended up having a dry spell, grass went dry, we're out there, it's kind of a break for me because I don't have to mow for a couple weeks, but it was up about shoulder high, and that corn was rolling, and that is a really influencer of the amount of K that goes into the plant. So just because you have K, it's where it's at, and that depth of K at the research farm is what really kind of helps to alleviate that. But on a day where that corn plant is about waist high, shoulder high, just about tassel, you're pulling up more pounds of K, 15, 16 pounds of K per day per acre than you are, and you're only at about 10 pounds of N. So you really have to have that K to N ratio almost 1-to-1 going into the plant. It's how you achieve it. You have to know your own soils, a little bit of your own weather patterns that you have to deal with, and then once you get there, that heavier amounts of K in your soil allows you to plant more population, which is extremely more yield that you have potential for. So it's kind of a thing. And the really good news, to Dan's point, N and phosphorus are being tracked. That's one of the key things in the state of Illinois and across the U.S., trying to figure out ways to reduce those applications and reduce the loss. And potassium is one of those that really we can put on more. It flocculates the soil, makes it much easier, better root growth, and it solves a lot of disease issues, but it also really assists with the nitrogen, and we can get away with less and still increase our yield. So that's kind of the whole part of it. When we look at N to S, it's about an 8 to 10 to 1. So for every pound of N we need to have, or every 10 pounds of N we need to have at least a pound of S available to those plants to maximize things. And so the more N you put on, or the soil produces, the more S you have to have. Dan's gonna
So
go
this
through
corn
these.
was planted 27th of April.
Did I mix you up?
No, you're fine. We're basically looking at a corn plant that we see a lot of fields. This corn plant, same day, 6 feet away. We're looking at a little girthier stalk at the bottom, just a hair taller. And the difference between these two is no ATS, 10 gallons the acre of ATS. Now, so what are we trying to gain by that sulfur treatment? Well, first off, sulfur is helping us move those nutrients through that plant better. Helps with nitrogen efficiency. You saw a bigger stalk. It's able to move nutrients, build a better factory. That's all these crops are, is a factory to produce grain. The other result is 16 around versus 14 around. Now, I haven't done the math, but I'm going to say you've more than paid for 10 gallon an acre of ATS. There's a lot of guys been using 5 gallon for a few years now. We're finding enough results showing that 5 gallon, we've well benefited to kick that up to 10 gallon the acre because the results are astounding and it's a great ROI.
And one of the things you'll always see with all these nutrients, whether it's potassium or sulfur, as you increase your population, which also gives you an opportunity for more yield, you also get more enhancement. So it allows you to move forward, and we're really on the brink of a couple of years having a short hybrid coming, and that will really increase the girth and the slow growth, more rooting, but it also will enhance things like potassium in the levels in the soil and sulfur levels in the soil. And we can't really hold sulfur very well, so it needs to be something in our data that really looks at it. And Dan's going to explain through the things that are hidden with sulfur that a lot of folks aren't thinking about.
Ed went to a bear meeting yesterday, and they said 2024 will be a commercial launch of the, they termed it smart corn instead of short corn, but they'll have the short corn out commercially in 2024. We saw it that
Nice.
yesterday.
So that, I'm just licking my lips for that short corn, because it's really going to give us lots of opportunity for better wind resistance, a bigger root system that's going to feed better, and it also gives us a lot of opportunity for foliar applications with machines similar to the one sitting up here, because those machines can go through it, do a lot more applications that really incentivize that crop to outperform normal crops. And of course, depending on your row configuration, if you move it to narrower rows, higher, denser populations, which we'll talk about in a minute here behind us.
Set maximum 7 foot tall.
Yes.
Their biggest problem was that ear placement. They got to be, to qualify in a cacao bag anyway, they got to be 2 foot or higher.
Yeah.
They had some,
It's got to be from knee to hip.
Yesterday they had some pretty short ears
Yep.
on that stalk.
Yep. And the earlier you plant, a little bit shorter that plant, and that's kind of indicative of our planting date trials. As we plant earlier, we shorten the height of that corn. And so all those pieces kind of fit together, and it's going to be really exciting, I think. With that, we'll have about the same amount of residue, but that residue will be packed into that girthier stalk. It's going to be cool.
So what is calcium, or what is sulfur doing for us? Well, as it shows you here, it breaks the bonds of soil. We know that calcium, magnesium are held tightly to soil particle, and calcium also ties up things like phosphate. So in essence, what sulfur does, it helps loosen those bonds of soil particle and flushes through the soil and flushes out. It may be a stretch, but I've actually seen some results where guys had really bad high pH, applying some ATS in a band on the row, in essence that sulfate pulled the calcium out, created calcium sulfate, and flushed, leached out through the soil and freed up nutrients. So basically what we're using with sulfur is not only plant food, the corn needs sulfur, but also how it could free up things with its relationships between those other nutrients.
So each of these, sulfur is a catalyst in the soil, and when it breaks those bonds, that really assists the microbial biological life to really stimulate them. And the earlier we can get that cooker going, the more nutrition we'll get out of our soils, and we have to apply less, but we get more yield. And that's the key to putting it on early. You know, if you look at the curve of when sulfur is actually needed in the plant, just like potassium, it's much later in the plant's life. But, you know, when we get to knee high, but that's really, you've missed half of the value of sulfur. Sulfur needs to be available in the sulfate, and that's the sulfate. As we apply that sulfur, it goes down, triggers and attaches, and it frees up all these bonds in the soil. So it's actually creating a whole bunch of nutrients. We can't always identify how much of these small amounts of iron and zinc and copper, that's what we're really seeing, and we're really seeing huge responses to that early application. That we started them in 2012 was the first time I put sulfur on. A lot of growers at that plot day back in 2012 said, what are those beans? What did you do different? I put 10 gallon of ATS on, I put 5 there and 3 there, and they go, whatever that is, I want it in my bean field. And they've just raised their bean yields tremendously. And we kind of backhandedly found out, oh, it's really good for corn too, you know. So it's part of the mechanism that works with potassium to increase that nitrogen efficiency. So if we were to run those same trials today that we ran on potassium back in the early days of 2007 through 2012 of plains, we would see that sulfur would have the same dynamics in allowing the nitrogen to be utilized better. So with that, I'm gonna kind of focus more. And you know, one thing when you're locked up in COVID, I'm in the office and I'm trying to figure out what to do, I'm trying to figure out. So I go to the internet and I'm really, you know, I've got a lot of questions in my mind of what am I seeing and how do we approach it. And it's really about trying to maximize this photosynthesis, but it's this protein synthesis. Protein synthesis is really nitrogen. Nitrogen and protein, really the same thing. We take a tissue test where we could really look at either, and it gives us an indication of how much protein or how much nitrogen we've got. We automatically have these elements, phosphorus and potassium. We already, you know that those are really, really important. We can't forget those. But the next, mag, sulfur, molybdenum, zinc, and copper are all elements that increase that nitrogen, the value of it. So you can get away with less in. So as we think about, and these are very small amounts, so as we got trials, and Brian's going to touch on those micros a little bit more, those are just essential to increasing the efficiency of the N you already paid for, or that the soil manufactured. You know, we're doing more and more to try and get more and more out of the soil, manufacture that, let the biologicals do their thing, and that's what's really huge. We have 3-4%, 2% organic matter. There's a value there, and we need to harness that, and that's going to keep us out of trouble. So protein synthesis and maximizing this photosynthesis and to get protein utilization. And behind us we have these trials that I tried last year, where I saw them out a couple of years ago at a trade show, and it made sense to me that maybe I ought to give them a shot. So I put out a few trials like Danny did here, and it's really about trying to get more sunshine to the corn plants. But we're also seeing, do you see the size of those beans? It's almost like we knew what we were doing, you know. The corn doesn't get any taller. If you look at the edges of a cornfield, they always are shorter stature on the outside because they've got all this sun. They put more to the roots and they actually produce more. So one of the things they taught us at this program was change your population. Instead of whatever Danny said his is 37,000 across the planter width, so you would change this outer row to a higher population because it's got more sun, more potential for sun, and then narrow the population down as you go to the center and then back out on the other end, and that'll maximize the yield. And you say, well, that's great, but you know, is it a couple bushel? Well, last year it was 40 bushel for me. 40 bushel per acre. It's in the plot book. I wouldn't have believed it, but it actually happened. And so I've really expanded that because I wanted to look at it in 20-inch rows, 30-inch rows, different scenarios, and we'll see what we get. You know, if it's that kind of bushels, and that was a later planting date last year, you know, because a lot of times you don't always do things exactly like you know, put it at the top of your list, like planting your first hybrids and all those kinds of things, at least in my book. So it happened about the third week of May last year that I planted, and I'd started the first week of April. Had I done it earlier, I think it would have been even more exciting, but 40 bushel, it was 294 compared to that lowly, you know, 260, where, you know, you just did everything wrong. So with that, let's take a look a little deeper at what we're thinking about. So as I'm doing all this work, trying to figure it out, so then I'm thinking, so if we maximize this sunshine on the corn and it works for the beans, all those elements that, you know, nitrogen are big, or soybeans are big users of N, bigger than corn. You know, we're at 400-500 pounds of N per acre that they're manufacturing in the soil. So they actually respond to all those, and you use those same elements to strengthen your soybean yields. But this is actually to maximize sunshine. So we need nitrogen to maximize it. And the way I think about it is every time we add one of these elements, we make the corn plants darker green. So thanks to Alex, he brought a black shirt for us, and we've got someone with a light colored shirt. We can make that plant darker green. It absorbs more sunlight, and it actually is more productive in sugars and proteins. And that's the value of really maximizing your yield. So as we add nitrogen, we darken the color. You go down here to the plots, you don't have any nitrogen added, it's yellow. Phosphorus, we know it adds color. Potassium, we know it adds more color. In fact, it's a strength in color, and it's not only color, but it's a sugar mover. Potassium is actually one of those elements that surrounds every cell wall. Potassium, calcium, and then it's got that boron cross-link that really strengthens that cell. Sulfur, to Danny's point, is also this darkening color. You saw his corn plants. Manganese. Manganese is one of those colors that's really important with photosynthesis, and it's one of the most difficult things we're having this year with the amount of water, and it seems like we're getting a little more tie-up of manganese. Iron's a mobile element in the soil, just like manganese and sulfur. So that and chloride, mobile element again, really important that we focus on these kinds of elements. Where do we get chloride? Does anybody apply chloride to their fields today? Is anybody doing it? I think every time you put potassium on, you're getting chloride free because it's potassium chloride is that molecule. The potassium stays in the soil, the chloride mobile, it's moving around, but it has a value. It has a value for photosynthesis, it has a value for disease prevention in your corn and soybeans. It's huge, and we haven't focused on it. These things, out of the 16 elements, we're just focused on 1, 2, 3. We need to go farther. In the mag, and that's the mag and the calcium are kind of what you got from Mother Nature, from the rock that your soil's formed from. So you can only adjust those small, and some guys live in an area with high amounts of mag and it'll actually impede your potassium, and some live in areas where it's really high amounts of calcium that'll impede your magnesium, and so you have to apply some. So these are all things that we need to keep focused on corn and soybeans, and as we do that, we'll maximize the photosynthesis, and we maximize yields.